My son said, "Dad, we think it's time you looked into a care home." I replied, "I understand." 3 weeks later, my attorney called him and said, "Your father has made a few adjustments you should know about." They sat me down at a dining table with a casserole and a manila envelope, and let me tell you, the casserole was delicious. The manila envelope, not so much. My name is Alistair Drummond. I am 67 years old. For 31 years, I managed port operations out of St. John, New Brunswick, coordinating cargo schedules across 7 berths, handling union relations, tracking weather delays and tide windows, and dealing with the unique brand of chaos that comes when 3 container ships arrive at once on a Tuesday morning in February with the temperature at -18 and someone has lost a manifest. I retired 4 years ago. I grew tomatoes. I read. I sipped good coffee slowly. By any reasonable measure, I was doing just fine. Before I tell you what I did next, tell me where you're watching this from. I'd genuinely like to know. My wife Helen passed 8 years ago. Heart attack. Sudden. I won't dwell on it because Helen would have found lingering deeply annoying, and she would have been right. After she was gone, I kept the house on Wentworth Street because it's a solid house, because Helen chose it, and because I am 67 years old and fully capable of deciding where I live. I have 2 children. My daughter Renata lives in Calgary and calls me every Sunday without exception, and once mailed me a jar of salsa she made herself, which I found both sweet and slightly alarming. My son Mitchell lives 40 minutes from me in Sussex with his wife Kara. Mitchell is 41. Kara is 38. They have a pleasant house, 2 children I adore, and what I now recognize as a very specific set of financial goals. My best friend is a man named Gordon Selkirk. We've known each other since 1987. He was my shift supervisor when I was 29 and insufferable, and he told me so straight to my face, and we've been close ever since. Gordon is now 70, retired from the same port, and spends most of his time playing terrible golf and refusing to admit it. I call him for everything. He always picks up. That is the full definition of loyalty, and I will not be taking questions on that. For the first 2 years after I retired, things with Mitchell and Kara were fine. They came for Sunday dinners now and then. The grandchildren ran through my house and broke nothing important. Kara brought store-bought rolls without apology, and I've always liked her enormously for that. Mitchell and I watched hockey and talked about the port and didn't really get in each other's way. It was comfortable, unremarkable, good in the way ordinary things are good when you're actually paying attention. Then, small things began to change. Nothing dramatic, nothing I could put my finger on directly. Mitchell started asking about the house, not curious questions, but careful ones. How was the maintenance going? Had I thought about whether the upkeep was becoming too much? Had I discussed my plans for the property with anyone? I answered honestly, because I had nothing to hide. The house was fine. The upkeep was manageable. My plans were to keep living there indefinitely, because again, I was 67 and perfectly fine. Kara started making remarks about my driving. I'd been in one minor incident 18 months earlier in a parking lot at a speed I can only describe as very slow. She brought it up twice more than the situation called for. She asked once if I was sleeping well. She asked once if I'd seen the doctor recently. On their own, these are the kinds of questions a caring daughter-in-law asks. Together over 3 months, with a certain frequency and a certain tone, they began to feel less like worry and more like a dossier being assembled. I noticed I didn't say anything. I just kept watering my tomatoes. In the 3rd week of October, Mitchell called and invited me to dinner on a Friday evening. He said Kara was making her chicken, and he wanted to catch up. I said I'd be there. I arrived at 6 swag with a bottle of wine, and what I thought was a reasonable expectation of a meal and a chat. The chicken was good. The first half of the evening was normal enough. We talked about the grandchildren. We talked about the weather. Mitchell refilled my glass once, and I thought nothing of it. Then after dinner, Kara cleared the plates, and Mitchell said he and Kara had been talking, and there was something they wanted to go over with me. He said they'd been worried for a while, and they wanted to speak from a place of love. I leaned back in my chair. He talked for maybe 12 minutes. Kara spoke for another 8. It was about my age, my isolation, the size of the house, the upkeep, my driving, and whether I was truly living my best life or just clinging to the past. They had looked into some options. There was a highly regarded place outside Moncton with a waiting list they had already quietly added my name to, just to explore. It had a gardening program. I could grow things there too, Mitchell said, as if that were the detail that would seal it. And there, on the side table, placed with a deliberate casualness that wasn't casual at all, was a manila folder. Inside, I could tell from the visible edge of the first page, were forms. I didn't reach for the folder. I sat very still and listened to every word and watched their faces, and somewhere around minute 14, I understood something clearly and completely. This had been rehearsed. The wording was too smooth, the transitions too polished, the folder too conveniently placed, the waiting list already started. This wasn't a dinner. It was a pitch, and I was the only person at the table who hadn't seen the slides in advance. They finished. They looked at me with expressions of carefully practiced concern. I said, "I understand." Mitchell looked relieved. Kara looked relieved. They exchanged the briefest glance. I said, "Thank you for dinner. The chicken was excellent." Then I put on my coat and drove home on the highway in the dark. And I didn't feel angry exactly. I felt clear-headed. There's a difference. If you've made it this far, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Genuinely, thank you. I called Gordon at 9:15 that night. He answered on the second ring. I said, "Gordon, they had a folder." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "What kind of folder?" I said, "The kind with forms in it." He said, "Say no more." He said, "What do you need?" I said, "I need the name of a good estate attorney, and I need you to let me talk for a while." He said, "Both of those I can do." Gordon had used a lawyer named Patricia Vance 2 years earlier when he was settling his own affairs after a health scare. He said she was sharp, straightforward, and had what he called a very particular way of making you feel like everything was already handled before she'd said a single word. He said she made him feel like a mildly interesting administrative problem, and he meant that as a compliment. I called Patricia Vance the next morning at 8:45. She answered herself, which I appreciated. I explained the entire situation to her. She listened without interrupting, which I appreciated even more. When I finished, she said, "Mr. Drummond, you are legally competent. You own your property outright, and you are under no obligation to do anything at all." Then she said, "However, if you would like to make some changes now while everything is fully on your terms, I have a few ideas." I said, "I have time this week." She said, "Tuesday at 2. I said, "Perfect." The next 3 weeks were the quietest I've spent in years. I kept my routine. I watered what remained of the tomatoes. I called Ranita on Sunday and told her nothing yet, because I wanted things settled before bringing her in. And because Ranita has a temper that once cleared a room at a school fundraiser, and I needed the process to run smoothly first. Patricia moved efficiently and without fuss. The house on Wentworth Street was placed into a trust. The trust named Ranita and a charitable foundation as beneficiaries. Mitchell was removed from the will entirely. The documents were structured so that any legal challenge would be lengthy, expensive, and unlikely to succeed, given that I had done all of this while demonstrably and thoroughly competent. Patricia had noted twice that the timing and documentation would be very helpful if anyone later tried to argue otherwise. I signed the final set of documents on a Thursday afternoon, and Patricia walked me out to the street and said, "You're all set, Mr. Drummond." I said, "Thank you, Patricia." She said, I'll call your son Monday morning. I said, that's fine. She said, do you want to know what I'm going to say? I said, just the general idea. She said, your father has made some significant changes to his estate, and you need to hear about them at your earliest convenience. I said, that will work nicely. If you've made it this far, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Genuinely, thank you. Mitchell called me Monday evening at 6:43. I know the time because I was watching the news and I made a note of it. He said, Dad, did you talk to a lawyer? I said, I did. He said, Dad, what did you do? I said, I made some adjustments to my affairs, Mitchell. I am 67 years old and fully capable of managing my own property and my own future, and I wanted to make sure everything was in order. I said, it felt like the right time. He said, this isn't what we wanted. I said, I know, I understand your intentions. I'm still in my house, and I plan to stay there, and I'm going to go finish watching the news now. He started to say something else, and I said, good night, Mitchell, and I hung up. He didn't call back that night. Kara sent a message 2 days later that was long and contained the phrase, we were only trying to help, 3 times. I read it once and set the phone down. I didn't reply. I called Gordon that evening. He said, how do you feel? I thought about it honestly and said, like a man who moved a very heavy thing entirely on his own and is surprised it worked. He laughed, a real one, the kind that comes from deep in the chest. He said, you want to come for dinner Thursday? Margaret is making soup. I said, what kind? He said, the good kind. I said, I'll be there. I sat at Gordon and Margaret's table on Thursday evening and ate a bowl of soup that was, in fact, the good kind. And Gordon told a story about his golf game that had absolutely no satisfying conclusion and took 9 minutes. I didn't time it. I'm only estimating. Renata called Sunday as always. I told her everything. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, Dad, you handled that better than I would have. I said, I know. She laughed. I laughed. We talked for 45 minutes. I still have the house on Wentworth Street. The tomatoes are done for the season, but I have plans for spring. Patricia sends a brief update every few months. Gordon loses at golf. Renata calls every Sunday. Mitchell and I haven't spoken since. That may change in time. I'm not holding on to anything tightly. I'm just keeping what's mine. Thanks for watching my video.